In 1952, archaeologists cut open a mysterious copper scroll hidden in a desert cave for nearly 2,000 years. What they found wasn't religious text, it was a treasure map. 64 locations, $3 billion in gold and silver, the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. And then they buried it again. Why? Because this wasn't just any treasure map. It was proof that everything you've been told about ancient history is a lie. While a secret cabal of Vatican-connected scholars spent 40 years suppressing these scrolls, artificial intelligence just revealed they're older than anyone dared admit. The same technology exposed that some scrolls weren't even made locally. Someone transported them from hundreds of miles away. But here's what they really don't want you to know. Hidden in these ancient texts are battle plans for Armageddon, proof of crucified messiahs before Jesus, and books deliberately removed from your Bible because they contained forbidden knowledge about fallen angels. Tonight we're breaking the silence, we're exposing the conspiracy, and we're following that treasure map. Are you ready to discover what they've been hiding in the desert? Because once you see the evidence, there's no going back. The official story goes like this. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat near the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave, heard pottery shatter, and stumbled upon the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Just a simple accident, a lucky find, nothing more to see here. But what if I told you that's exactly what they want you to believe? Because when you dig deeper into the evidence, the cracks in this neat little narrative start to show. First, let's talk about timing. 1947, the exact year the State of Israel was being established. The exact moment when control over ancient Jewish artifacts would become a political powder keg. Convenient, isn't it? Muhammad ed-Dib wasn't just wandering aimlessly. Local Bedouins had been systematically searching these caves for years, looking for artifacts to sell in the lucrative antiquities market. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't accidental, it was methodical treasure hunting. And here's where it gets interesting. Within hours of the discovery, these priceless scrolls were whisked away by academic authorities and religious institutions. No independent verification, no public access, no questions asked. 7 scrolls from that first cave immediately disappeared into the hands of scholars with very specific agendas. The American schools of Oriental research got their hands on some. The Hebrew University acquired others. But here's what's truly suspicious. A small secretive group of predominantly Catholic scholars quickly established absolute control over not just these initial scrolls, but every subsequent discovery in the caves. Why Catholics? Why this particular group of academics who just happen to have direct connections to Vatican propaganda offices? These weren't neutral scientists seeking truth. These were religious gatekeepers with institutional interests to protect. And they knew they had found something explosive, something that could shake the foundations of organized religion. Because what Muhammad ed-Dib had stumbled upon wasn't just ancient religious texts. He had discovered a library, a complete archive of forbidden knowledge that had been deliberately hidden away for nearly 2,000 years. The scrolls spoke of alternative versions of biblical events. They contained prophecies that didn't match official church doctrine. They described religious practices that predated Christianity by centuries, yet bore striking similarities to early Christian rituals. Most dangerous of all, they suggested that what we call Christianity might not be as unique or divinely inspired as believers had been told. So what did these gatekeepers do? They did what powerful institutions always do when faced with inconvenient truths. They classified the evidence. They restricted access. They controlled the narrative. And they began the longest academic cover-up in modern history. Let me introduce you to the men who would control humanity's access to these ancient secrets for the next 4 decades. They called themselves the International Team, but don't let that official-sounding name fool you. This was no diverse group of international scholars working in the spirit of open academic inquiry. This was a Catholic cabal. Led by Father Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican priest, the team was packed with Vatican-connected academics. Father Joseph Milik, Father Patrick Skihan, Father John Starkey. Notice a pattern. These weren't just any scholars, they were men whose careers and reputations were tied directly to maintaining Catholic orthodoxy. But it gets worse. As Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago would later document, at least 2 members of this inner circle were outspoken anti-Semites. In an era when the relationship between Christianity and Judaism was being redefined after the Holocaust, these men were put in charge of interpreting Jewish religious texts. Think about that for a moment. Anti-Semitic Catholic priests controlling the world's access to ancient Jewish manuscripts. What could possibly go wrong? The team had exclusive rights to translate, interpret, and publish the scrolls. No outside scholars were allowed access to the original manuscripts. No photographs were made available to the broader academic community. No independent verification was permitted. They had created an academic monopoly over what many considered humanity's most important archaeological find. And they used that monopoly to protect their institutional interests. Father de Vaux quickly promoted the theory that the scrolls belonged to a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who had lived in an isolated community at Qumran near the Dead Sea. According to this official narrative, the Essenes were a small marginal group that had no significant influence on mainstream Judaism or early Christianity. They were religious outcasts who had simply hidden their library before the Romans destroyed their settlement in 68 CE. Neat, tidy, non-threatening to Christian doctrine. But even as this official theory was being promoted, dissenting voices within the academic community were being systematically silenced. When John Allegro, one of the few non-religious members of the team, began suggesting connections between the scrolls and early Christianity, he was immediately ostracized by his colleagues. When Edmund Wilson wrote about these connections in The New Yorker, the Catholic members of the team launched a coordinated campaign to discredit his work. They couldn't refute his evidence, so they attacked his credentials and questioned his motivations. The pattern was clear: conform to the official narrative or be destroyed professionally. Meanwhile, the Vatican maintained direct communication with team members through official channels. Papal representatives regularly consulted with the scholars. Church doctrine influenced translation decisions. Critical manuscripts that might challenge Catholic teaching were set aside for further study, a euphemism for indefinite suppression. For 4 decades, this small group of religious gatekeepers controlled humanity's access to its own history. They decided what could be published and what must remain secret. They determined which theories were academically acceptable and which were dangerous heresy. And the most dangerous truth of all, what they found in those caves suggested that the origins of Christianity were far more complex, far more Jewish, and far more politically motivated than the Church had ever admitted. By 1989, the academic world had reached a breaking point. Biblical Archaeology Review editor Herschel Shanks didn't mince words. The team of scholars assigned more than 30 years ago to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls will never publish them because they cannot. The task was simply too great. They will never do it because they cannot do it. They have failed utterly and completely. But failure implies incompetence. And what was happening with the Dead Sea Scrolls wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate obstruction. Consider the facts. By the 1980s, the Nag Hammadi Library discovered in Egypt, just 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls had been completely published and made available to scholars worldwide. These Gnostic texts, which arguably posed an even greater challenge to Orthodox Christianity, were translated and distributed within 35 years of their discovery. Yet the Dead Sea Scrolls found earlier and in better condition remained locked away in a climate-controlled room that scholars nicknamed the Scrollery. Only 8 men had access. 8 men controlled humanity's gateway to its own past. The most complete scrolls, those that could be easily read and quickly translated, were published soon after their discovery. These included relatively non-controversial texts like biblical manuscripts that largely confirmed existing versions of Scripture, perfect for reassuring the faithful that their beliefs remained unchallenged. But the thousands of fragments, the pieces that required careful assembly, patient reconstruction, and scholarly detective work, these remained perpetually under study. These fragments contained the most potentially explosive material sectarian documents describing alternative religious practices, prophetic texts that didn't match biblical prophecy, and historical accounts that contradicted official church timelines. Year after year, conference after conference, the international team promised that publication was imminent. Just a few more years, they said. The work is complex, they explained. We must ensure accuracy, they insisted. But behind closed doors, a different story was emerging. Team members were aging, retiring, even dying, and their exclusive access died with them. Fragments assigned to individual scholars simply disappeared from academic discourse when those scholars moved on. Entire sections of the scrolls became orphaned, their contents known only to men who were no longer talking. The Israeli government, which had gained control of the scrolls after the 1967 Six-Day War, seemed strangely reluctant to pressure the team for faster publication. Despite owning these priceless artifacts of Jewish heritage, Israeli authorities continued to honor the access restrictions imposed by Jordan decades earlier. Why? What political pressures were being applied behind the scenes? What diplomatic considerations were keeping Israel from asserting control over its own archaeological heritage? The answer lies in the explosive nature of what the scrolls actually contained. Because by the 1980s, independent scholars who had managed to glimpse fragments of the unpublished material were making disturbing claims. They suggested the scrolls contained evidence of multiple messianic figures, alternative creation stories, and religious practices that predated both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Most dangerous of all, they hinted that the scrolls might contain references to historical figures who matched the description of Jesus Christ, but who lived and died a century before the traditional dates of Jesus' ministry. Such revelations could shatter the foundations of faith for millions of believers. They could delegitimize the authority of both Catholic and Jewish religious establishments. They could prove that the two great monotheistic religions were built on historical lies and theological fabrications. So the gatekeepers did what they had always done: they delayed, obfuscated, and suppressed. They protected their institutions at the expense of truth. They chose religious comfort over historical honesty. But truth has a way of breaking free no matter how tightly it's controlled. And in 1991, that truth would finally explode into public view in a way that would embarrass the academic establishment and expose the conspiracy that had hidden humanity's heritage for nearly half a century. September 1991. The Huntington Library in San Marino, California, made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. They were going to do something radical, something that would shatter the 44-year monopoly of the international team. They were going to give unrestricted access to complete photographic copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls to any qualified scholar who requested them. The reaction was immediate and telling. The Israel Antiquities Authority was furious. The international team members were outraged. Legal threats flew. Accusations of academic piracy filled scholarly journals. The very people who claimed to be guardians of human knowledge were fighting desperately to keep that knowledge suppressed. But why? If these were simply ancient religious texts that confirmed existing beliefs, why such panic over their release? The answer became clear once independent scholars finally gained access to the forbidden materials. What they found contradicted decades of official interpretation and revealed the extent to which alternative theories had been systematically silenced. Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago had been challenging the official Essene theory for years, arguing that the scrolls actually originated from libraries in Jerusalem and had been hidden in the Qumran caves during the Roman siege of 70 CE. His theory suggested these weren't the writings of an isolated sect, but mainstream Jewish religious documents that reflected the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. But Golb's work had been marginalized by the international team. His requests for access to unpublished fragments were denied. His attempts to present alternative interpretations at academic conferences were blocked. The gatekeepers had created an echo chamber where only their approved theories could be heard. The Huntington Library's decision changed everything. Suddenly, scholars worldwide could examine the evidence for themselves. They could verify translations, challenge interpretations, and propose alternative theories based on the actual documents, rather than selective quotations filtered through the international team's ideological lens. And what they discovered was stunning. The scrolls revealed a far more complex religious landscape than anyone had imagined. Multiple Jewish sects with competing theological views, alternative biblical texts with significant variations from accepted scripture, prophetic traditions that didn't match later Christian or Jewish orthodoxy. Most controversially, they found evidence of messianic expectations that closely paralleled later Christian beliefs about Jesus. Some scrolls spoke of a suffering, dying, and possibly resurrected messianic figure. Others described a teacher who would be persecuted by religious authorities and vindicated by God. These discoveries didn't prove that Jesus was fictional, as some sensationalist claims suggested. But they did prove that the religious ideas associated with Jesus weren't unique, weren't revolutionary, and weren't evidence of divine revelation. They were part of a broader Jewish theological tradition that had been developing for centuries before the traditional dates of Jesus' birth. Such revelations posed an existential threat to Christian claims of uniqueness and divine origin. They suggested that Christianity might be better understood as one variant of Second Temple Judaism, rather than a radical new religion founded by the Son of God. Even more disturbing, the scrolls contained detailed descriptions of religious practices and organizational structures that closely matched what we know about early Christian communities. Ritual meals, baptismal practices, communal living arrangements, hierarchical leadership structures, all of these supposedly distinctive Christian innovations had precedence in pre-Christian Jewish sectarian movements. The implications were staggering. If these practices were already established in Jewish communities before Jesus, then what exactly had made Christianity unique? What divine revelation had Jesus brought that wasn't already present in existing Jewish tradition? These were the questions that the international team had spent 40 years trying to prevent the world from asking. These were the inconvenient truths that threatened the very foundations of organized religion. But now the evidence was public. The suppressed material was available for independent analysis. The conspiracy of silence had been broken. And the most explosive discoveries were yet to come. For 4 decades, we were told a simple story about the Dead Sea Scrolls. A small group of Jewish ascetics called the Essenes, led by a mysterious figure known as the Teacher of Righteousness, established a monastic community at Qumran near the Dead Sea. They copied religious texts, developed their own theological interpretations, and hid their library in nearby caves before the Romans destroyed their settlement in 68 CE. This narrative was neat, contained, and most importantly non-threatening to established religious institutions. The Essenes were portrayed as an isolated sect with minimal influence on mainstream Judaism or early Christianity. Their ideas might be interesting from a historical perspective, but they posed no challenge to orthodox religious belief. But what if this entire narrative was carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a far more explosive truth? Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago has spent decades challenging this official story, and his arguments are devastating. The archaeological evidence at Qumran doesn't support the existence of a large monastic community. The ruins suggest a military fortress, not a religious retreat. The cemetery contains too few burials for a community that supposedly existed for 2 centuries. The pottery and coins found at the site indicate diverse occupants over time, not a stable sectarian group. Most damning of all the scrolls themselves contradict the Essene theory. They represent too many different handwriting styles, too many different theological perspectives, and too many different historical periods to have been produced by a single isolated community. The linguistic analysis reveals dialectical variations consistent with documents from different geographical regions, not the standardized language we would expect from a closed sectarian group. The diversity of thought reflected in the scrolls is staggering. Some documents promote strict ritual purity, while others are relatively liberal. Some embrace apocalyptic expectations, while others focus on practical legal matters. Some reflect Pharisaic influence, others Sadducean traditions, still others represent completely independent theological positions. This isn't the product of an isolated sect with a unified ideology. This is the library of a major religious and cultural center, a collection of documents representing the full spectrum of Second Temple Jewish thought. So where did this library come from? Golb's revolutionary theory suggests that the scrolls represent the hidden archive of Jerusalem's religious institutions. When the Romans besieged the city in 70 CE, religious leaders gathered the most precious manuscripts from the temple synagogues and private collections and transported them to remote hiding places in the Judean wilderness. Qumran was chosen not because it was the home of the Essenes, but because its caves provided secure storage for humanity's most precious religious heritage. This theory explains everything the official narrative cannot. It explains the diversity of texts, the variation in handwriting, the range of theological perspectives, and the sheer volume of material. It explains why these documents represent the finest examples of Second Temple Jewish literature, rather than the sectarian writings of an isolated group. But it also explains why this theory has been so viciously suppressed by the academic establishment. Because if Golb is right, then the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't the curiosity of a marginal sect. They're the lost archive of Second Temple Judaism itself. They represent the religious thought that was developing in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. They reflect the theological environment in which Christianity emerged. They contain the ideas, practices, and expectations that shaped both Judaism and early Christianity during their most formative period. In other words, they're not a sideshow to the main historical narrative. They are the main historical narrative. This realization has terrifying implications for religious orthodoxy. It suggests that what we call Christianity wasn't a radical departure from Judaism, but a natural development within existing Jewish theological traditions. It implies that the ideas attributed to Jesus were already circulating in Jewish religious circles decades or even centuries before his birth. Most dangerous of all, it raises the possibility that the Jesus described in the Gospels wasn't a unique historical figure, but a literary compilation of various messianic traditions that were already well established in Second Temple Judaism. These are the questions that the international team spent 40 years trying to prevent scholars from exploring. These are the theories that threaten to undermine the entire foundation of Christian claims to divine uniqueness and revelation. The Essene Myth was designed to contain and neutralize the explosive potential of the scrolls. By portraying them as the product of an isolated sect, the gatekeepers could acknowledge their historical importance while denying their relevance to mainstream religious development. But the evidence won't support this comfortable fiction any longer. The scrolls are too important, too diverse, and too central to Second Temple Judaism to be dismissed as sectarian curiosities. The truth is breaking free whether the religious establishment likes it or not. When you strip away the comfortable myths and examine the hard evidence, a very different picture emerges about the Dead Sea Scrolls. This isn't the story of an isolated religious sect. This is the story of the greatest rescue operation in ancient history. Picture this: Jerusalem 68 CE. The Roman legions are closing in. The city that has stood as the center of Jewish civilization for nearly 1,000 years is about to be destroyed. The temple, the focus of Jewish religious life since Solomon, will soon be reduced to rubble. Everything that defines Jewish identity is about to be obliterated. But the religious leaders of Jerusalem aren't going to let their heritage disappear without a fight. In a desperate race against time, they gather the most precious manuscripts from the temple archives, the synagogue libraries, and the private collections of wealthy families. These documents represent centuries of Jewish thought law prophecy and religious innovation. They are the intellectual DNA of an entire civilization. Where can they hide these priceless texts from Roman destruction? They need locations that are remote, secure, and likely to preserve the documents for future generations. The caves of Qumran, carved into limestone cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, provide the perfect solution. This theory, championed by Professor Norman Golb and supported by mounting archaeological evidence, explains everything that the official Essene narrative cannot. It explains why the scrolls represent such a diverse range of handwriting styles, because they were copied by scribes working in different institutions across Jerusalem. It explains why they reflect such varied theological perspectives, because they represent the full spectrum of Second Temple Jewish thought, not the narrow ideology of a single sect. Most importantly, it explains why these documents are so historically significant. They aren't the marginal writings of religious outcasts. They are the core texts of Second Temple Judaism, the religious literature that was being studied, debated, and developed in Jerusalem during the most crucial period of Jewish history. But there's an even more explosive implication to this theory. If the scrolls represent mainstream Jewish religious thought from the 1st century CE, then they provide an unprecedented window into the intellectual environment that produced both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Consider what this means for our understanding of Christian origins. Every idea that Christians claim as uniquely revealed to Jesus, messianic expectations, divine sonship resurrection theology, communal religious practice, even specific ethical teachings can be found in these pre-Christian Jewish documents. The scrolls describe a Son of God figure who will judge the nations. They speak of a suffering servant who will atone for the sins of Israel. They describe resurrection expectations and end times prophecies that closely parallel later Christian beliefs. They outline communal practices, including ritual meals and baptismal ceremonies that match what we know about early Christian communities. The parallel is so exact that early scholars like André Dupont-Sommer caused an international sensation in the 1950s by suggesting that Jesus was simply a later version of the teacher of righteousness described in the scrolls. Though most scholars rejected these specific claims, they couldn't deny the obvious similarities between scroll theology and Christian doctrine. But here's what the religious establishment really doesn't want you to understand. These similarities aren't evidence that Christianity borrowed from the scrolls. They're evidence that Christianity emerged from the same Jewish theological matrix that produced the scrolls. In other words, what we call Christianity wasn't a radical new religion revealed by God to a unique individual. It was a predictable development within existing Jewish religious thought, one possible outcome of theological trends that were already well established in 1st century Judaism. This realization destroys the entire foundation of Christian claims to divine revelation and unique truth. If Jesus' teachings were already present in pre-Christian Jewish literature, then what exactly did he reveal that wasn't already known? If Christian practices were already established in Jewish communities, then what made the early church distinctive? The Jerusalem connection theory suggests that Christianity wasn't the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, as Christians claim. but simply one interpretation of that prophecy among many others that were being developed simultaneously in various Jewish communities. Even more disturbing for Christian orthodoxy, the scrolls suggest that the specific combination of messianic ideas that Christians attribute to Jesus wasn't unique to him. Multiple figures in Second Temple Judaism seem to have been viewed as potential messiahs with similar characteristics and similar missions. This raises the terrifying possibility, terrifying at least for believing Christians, that the Jesus described in the Gospels wasn't a single historical individual at all, but a literary compilation of various messianic traditions that were circulating in first-century Jewish communities. The Jerusalem connection doesn't just challenge Christian uniqueness, it suggests that Christianity might be based on a historical fiction created by combining real Jewish theological traditions with mythological narratives about a figure who may never have existed in the form described by the Gospels. No wonder the Catholic gatekeepers fought so hard to suppress this theory. No wonder they promoted the comfortable myth of an isolated Essene sect, instead of confronting the implications of mainstream Jewish origins. The truth about the Jerusalem connection threatens the very foundation of Christian faith, and that truth is now impossible to suppress. Sometimes the most devastating evidence comes from the most unexpected sources. While human scholars spent decades debating theories and defending institutional orthodoxies, machines have been quietly analysing the Dead Sea Scrolls with cold mathematical precision, and what they've discovered is shattering everything we thought we knew about these ancient documents. In 2024, an artificial intelligence system called Enoch delivered a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. After analysing the handwriting patterns and paleographic features of the scrolls, the AI concluded that many of these documents are significantly older than scholars had previously believed. In some cases, they may predate the traditional dates of their composition by decades or even centuries. Think about what this means. If these texts are older than we thought, then the religious ideas they contain weren't responses to early Christianity, they were the source material for early Christianity. The theological concepts that Christians claim as divine revelations may have been circulating in Jewish communities for generations before Jesus was supposedly born. But the AI discoveries are just the beginning. Advanced imaging technology has revealed layers of information that the human eye could never detect. Multispectral imaging, a technique that photographs documents under different wavelengths of light, has uncovered hidden text, erased passages, and overwritten corrections that tell a very different story about how these scrolls were created and used. Some documents show evidence of systematic editing, with certain passages deliberately obscured or altered. Others reveal underlying texts that contradict the visible surface writing. Most intriguingly, several scrolls contain marginal notes and corrections that suggest they were working documents actively used and revised by multiple scribes over extended periods. This evidence supports Professor Golb's theory that the scrolls represent a living library rather than the static archive of an isolated sect. These weren't museum pieces carefully preserved by reclusive monks. They were functional religious texts being actively studied, debated, and revised by scholars working in Jerusalem's religious institutions. Even more revealing is what DNA analysis has discovered about the physical materials used to create the scrolls. Traditional scholarship assumed that documents found in the same cave were created by the same community using local materials. But genetic testing of the parchment and leather has revealed a startling truth: many scrolls were made from animal skins that originated hundreds of miles away from Qumran. Some scrolls are written on cow leather rather than the sheep and goat skins typical of local production. Others show evidence of preparation techniques that were characteristic of different geographical regions. The inescapable conclusion is that these documents were transported to Qumran from distant locations, exactly what we would expect if they represented a rescued archive from Jerusalem's libraries. But perhaps the most disturbing technological revelation involves what scholars call the missing links. Advanced computer analysis has identified patterns in the scrolls, that suggest significant portions of the original library are still missing. The documents we have represent fragments of larger works, pieces of more comprehensive theological and historical narratives. Where are the missing pieces? Were they deliberately removed by the gatekeepers who controlled access for 40 years? Were certain scrolls deemed too dangerous to release and quietly suppressed? Or are there still undiscovered caches hidden in other caves throughout the Judean wilderness? The technology is revealing another uncomfortable truth. Some of the scrolls that were published early show signs of having been selectively edited before translation. Certain passages that might have been controversial were transcribed differently in the official publications than what the imaging technology reveals on the original documents. In other words, even when the gatekeepers allowed material to be published, they apparently felt free to alter the content to make it less threatening to religious orthodoxy. They weren't just suppressing evidence, they were actively falsifying it. Recent spectrographic analysis has also revealed traces of materials that shouldn't exist if the official timeline is correct. Some scrolls contain mineral deposits and chemical signatures that suggest they were stored in different locations before being placed in the Qumran caves. Others show wear patterns consistent with frequent handling over extended periods, not the careful preservation we would expect from a monastic library. The cumulative weight of this technological evidence is devastating to the official narrative. Every new scientific technique applied to the scrolls reveals more evidence of complexity, diversity, and mainstream Jewish origins. Every advanced analysis contradicts another aspect of the Essene theory. But here's what's truly frightening about these technological revelations. They suggest we've barely scratched the surface of what the scrolls actually contain. If artificial intelligence and advanced imaging can reveal so much hidden information in documents that scholars have been studying for 70 years, what other secrets are waiting to be discovered? What happens when even more sophisticated technology is applied to scrolls that remain unpublished or understudied? What revelations might emerge from fragments that are currently deemed too damaged or fragmentary to translate? The machines are telling us that everything we've been told about the Dead Sea Scrolls is wrong. The question is, are we brave enough to listen to what they're revealing, or will we continue to cling to comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths? The technology doesn't care about protecting religious institutions or preserving traditional beliefs. It only cares about facts, and the facts are pointing toward conclusions that threaten the very foundation of organized religion. While scholars debated the authenticity of ancient documents, a modern deception was unfolding right under their noses. In 2020, the art fraud investigation team, led by Colette Loll, delivered a devastating conclusion about the Museum of the Bible's Dead Sea Scroll collection. Every single fragment was fake. Not some of them, not most of them, every single one. These weren't crude forgeries that could be spotted by casual examination. These were sophisticated fakes that had fooled prominent biblical scholars, convinced museum curators, and attracted millions of dollars in investment from collectors. The level of deception was so sophisticated that it took high magnification analysis and chemical testing to expose the truth. But here's what makes this scandal so disturbing: it wasn't an isolated incident. The Museum of the Bible forgeries were part of a much larger network of deception that has been operating in the antiquities market for decades. And the existence of this forgery network raises terrifying questions about the authenticity of other Dead Sea Scroll materials that remain in private collections around the world. The forgers used genuine, ancient leather, probably sourced from ancient shoes or sandals, and wrote on it with ink that appeared to match authentic scroll materials. They artificially aged the documents using techniques that created convincing patina and wear patterns. Most cleverly, they created fragments that contained text similar to but not identical to known authentic scrolls, making them seem like new discoveries rather than copies of existing materials. This level of sophistication suggests the work of professionals with extensive knowledge of ancient writing techniques, chemical aging processes, and scholarly expectations. These weren't amateurs trying to make a quick profit. This was an organized operation with the resources and expertise to fool some of the world's leading experts. But why create fake Dead Sea Scrolls? The obvious answer is money-authentic scroll fragments can sell for millions of dollars. But there's a more sinister possibility that emerges when you consider the broader context of scroll suppression and institutional control. What if the Forgery Network wasn't just about profit? What if it was about muddying the waters of authentic scholarship? Think about it. If the antiquities market is flooded with sophisticated fakes, how can scholars distinguish between genuine discoveries and manufactured deceptions? How can new findings be trusted when the authentication process has been compromised? This confusion serves the interests of those who want to maintain control over the narrative surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls. If every new discovery is potentially suspect, then the authority remains with the established gatekeepers who control access to the definitely authentic materials. Independent scholars who claim to have found significant new evidence can be dismissed as victims of forgery, whether their materials are genuine or not. The forgery scandal also reveals how the economics of the antiquities market have corrupted scroll scholarship. Private collectors motivated by investment potential rather than academic integrity have been willing to pay enormous sums for fragments that professional archaeologists would never be allowed to purchase. This has created a shadow market where unprovenanced materials change hands without proper authentication or scholarly documentation. Some of these private collections may contain genuinely important materials that have been removed from the scholarly record entirely. Critical fragments that could resolve major debates about scroll origins, dating, or content may be sitting in climate-controlled display cases in private homes, inaccessible to researchers and unknown to the academic community. Even more disturbing is the possibility that some forgeries were created specifically to support particular theories about scroll interpretation. If you wanted to discredit alternative theories about scroll origins, what better way than to introduce fake evidence that seems to support those theories, then expose the evidence as fraudulent? The resulting scandal would damage not just the specific theory, but the credibility of any scholar who had endorsed it. The Museum of the Bible scandal exposed another layer of the problem, the institutional pressure to acquire spectacular artifacts, regardless of their provenance. Museums and collectors, eager to display prestigious materials, have been willing to bypass proper authentication procedures when the potential prizes are sufficiently impressive. This institutional corruption extends beyond private collectors. Major universities, religious institutions, and even government agencies have been caught up in the rush to acquire scroll materials without adequate verification. The desire to possess these legendary artifacts has overwhelmed scholarly caution and professional ethics. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Forgery Network is what it reveals about the current state of scroll scholarship. If some of the world's leading experts can be fooled by sophisticated fakes, how much confidence can we have in their authentication of genuinely ancient materials? How many authentic scrolls in major collections might actually be modern fabrications? The forgery scandal suggests that the entire foundation of modern scroll scholarship may be compromised, not because the authentic scrolls are fake, but because the process of distinguishing authentic materials from sophisticated forgeries has broken down under commercial and institutional pressures. In a field where access to authentic materials has been controlled by a small group of gatekeepers for decades, the introduction of convincing fakes creates a perfect storm of confusion and corruption. When even the experts can't tell real from fake, how can anyone trust the conclusions being drawn from these materials? The Forgery Network isn't just a threat to collectors and museums, it's a threat to truth itself. And in a field where truth has already been systematically suppressed and manipulated for institutional purposes, This additional layer of deception may be the final nail in the coffin of honest scholarship. Deep in Cave 3 at Qumran, archaeologists found something that defied every expectation about ancient religious manuscripts. While other Dead Sea Scrolls were written on leather or papyrus, this document was etched into thin sheets of copper that had been rolled together like an ancient metal scroll. When they finally cut it open in 1952, what they discovered wasn't religious text or biblical commentary. It was a treasure map. Not just any treasure map, possibly the most valuable treasure map in human history. The copper scroll contains precise directions to 64 hiding places where enormous quantities of gold, silver, and religious artifacts have been concealed. If the measurements are accurate and the locations are real, we're talking about treasure worth over $3 billion in today's currency. But here's what makes this discovery so explosive. This wasn't pirate treasure or royal hoards hidden by ancient kings. Based on the descriptions and locations, this appears to be the lost treasure of the Jerusalem Temple, the most sacred artifacts and accumulated wealth of Second Temple Judaism, hidden just before the Roman destruction in 70 CE. Listen to the specific instructions from the first entry. In the fortress which is in the Vale of Achor, 40 cubits under the steps entering to the east, a money chest and its contents of a weight of 17 talents. 17 talents of silver would be worth approximately $40 million today, and that's just the first location. Other entries are equally specific and equally staggering. Under the tomb in the valley, dig down 9 cubits into the southern corner of the courtyard. There will be silver and gold vessels given as offerings, bowls, cups, sprinkling basins, libation tubes, and pitchers. Altogether, they will total 609 pieces. Another location promises 40 talents of silver buried 16 cubits under the eastern corner. The detail is extraordinary. The copper scroll doesn't just list treasure, it provides a precise archaeological guide to recovering the most precious artifacts of ancient Judaism. Temple vessels used in daily worship, golden implements crafted for specific religious ceremonies, silver treasures accumulated through centuries of pilgrim offerings. But here's where the mystery deepens. Why would someone go to the enormous expense and effort of creating a permanent copper scroll to record these locations? Copper was precious in the ancient world. Creating a detailed map on metal sheets would have been incredibly costly. The only reason to use such a durable medium would be if you expected the information to remain hidden for a very long time. This suggests the treasure wasn't temporarily hidden during a brief military crisis. It was deliberately concealed with the expectation that the political situation might not change for decades or even centuries. The creators of the Copper Scroll were planning for the long-term preservation of Judaism's most precious heritage. Even more intriguingly, the language and geographical references in the Copper Scroll are deliberately cryptic. Locations are described using code names and local references that would only be meaningful to people with intimate knowledge of the Jerusalem area. The subterranean shaft that is on the north side of the mouth of the ravine belonging to Beth Tamar might be perfectly clear to someone familiar with first-century Jerusalem geography, but it's useless to outsiders. This suggests the Copper Scroll wasn't meant to be a general treasure map available to anyone who found it. It was an internal document created for a specific group of people who would know how to interpret the coded references. In other words, it was designed to help the legitimate inheritors of this treasure recover their heritage when political conditions made it safe to do so. But those political conditions never changed. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem was so complete that the social and religious structures that created the Copper Scroll were never restored. The people who knew how to interpret its coded language died or were scattered. The specific geographical landmarks it references were destroyed or altered beyond recognition. For nearly 2,000 years, the greatest treasure map in history has been useless because the cultural context that gave it meaning was obliterated. The locations described in the Copper Scroll remain mysteries because the civilization that created those descriptions no longer exists. Yet modern treasure hunters refuse to give up. Teams of archaeologists, adventurers, and conspiracy theorists have been searching for Copper Scroll treasure for decades. Some claim to have identified possible locations. Others insist they've found evidence of ancient excavations at sites that match the scroll's descriptions. But here's what's really suspicious. If anyone has actually found Copper Scroll treasure, they've kept remarkably quiet about it. Given the international legal complications surrounding ancient artifacts, the political sensitivities around Jewish religious objects, and the sheer value of the items involved, successful treasure hunters would have every reason to keep their discoveries secret. Which raises a terrifying possibility. What if the treasure has already been found? What if powerful individuals or institutions have been quietly recovering Copper Scroll artifacts for decades, building private collections of the most sacred objects in Jewish history? The Copper Scroll represents more than lost treasure. It's a window into the desperate final days of Second Temple Judaism, when religious leaders realized their entire civilization was about to be destroyed and took extraordinary measures to preserve what they could for future generations. Their plan worked at least partially. The religious texts they hid in caves have revolutionized our understanding of ancient Judaism and early Christianity. But the physical treasure, the golden vessels, the silver implements, the precious artifacts that embodied centuries of religious devotion, remains lost. Unless, of course, it isn't lost at all, unless it's sitting in private collections, government vaults, or institutional archives hidden from public view just as effectively as it was hidden in the Judean wilderness 2,000 years ago. The $3 billion question isn't whether the treasure exists. It's whether anyone has the courage to admit they found it. At the end of the Copper Scroll, after 63 detailed descriptions of hidden treasure, there's one final entry that might be the most important of all. Location 64 doesn't describe gold or silver or precious artifacts. Instead, it provides directions to a copy of this writing and its interpretation and their measures, with a detailed description of each and every thing. In other words, the Copper Scroll isn't the only treasure map. There's another scroll hidden separately that contains more complete information about the treasure locations. Scholars call this mysterious document the Silver Scroll, and it's never been found. But what if it has been found? What if the Silver Scroll was discovered centuries ago and used to recover the temple treasure, only to disappear again into the shadows of history? This is exactly what researcher Robert Eisenman suggests in his controversial book, James, the Brother of Jesus. According to Eisenman's theory, the Silver Scroll was discovered by the Knights Templar during the First Crusade, when they established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. With access to the complete treasure map, the Templars systematically excavated the hidden caches described in the Copper Scroll and used the recovered wealth to finance their military operations across the Holy Land. The theory is tantalizing because it explains several historical mysteries. How did the Knights Templar, initially a small group of impoverished knights, become one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe? Their rapid accumulation of enormous resources has never been satisfactorily explained by historians. If they discovered and exploited the temple treasure, their sudden wealth would make perfect sense. The Templars certainly had the opportunity. They occupied the Temple Mount for nearly 2 centuries with unlimited access to excavate beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple. They had the motivation funding their expensive military campaigns required enormous resources. And they had the capability. Their organization included engineers, miners, and other specialists who could have undertaken systematic archaeological excavation. Even more suggestively, the Templars were eventually destroyed by accusations of heresy and blasphemy that included claims they possessed secret religious knowledge and alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine. If they had discovered not just treasure, but religious documents that contradicted official church teaching, such accusations would make perfect sense. When the Templars were disbanded in 1307, their enormous wealth mysteriously disappeared. Despite intensive efforts by King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V to seize Templar assets, most of their treasure was never recovered. The official explanation is that Templar leaders managed to hide their wealth before their arrest, but this seems implausible given the coordinated nature of the crackdown. What if the missing Templar treasure was actually the recovered temple treasure which the organization returned to hiding places known only to their inner circle? What if the legendary Templar treasure that conspiracy theorists have been seeking for centuries is actually the same $3 billion hoard described in the Copper Scroll? This theory connects two of history's greatest treasure mysteries, the lost temple treasure and the missing Templar wealth. It suggests that the artifacts described in the Copper Scroll didn't remain buried in the Judean wilderness, but were recovered in the 12th century and used to finance medieval military campaigns before being hidden again when the Templars were destroyed. But there's an even more explosive possibility suggested by some researchers. What if the Silver Scroll contained more than just treasure locations? What if it included religious documents, historical records, or other materials that provided alternative accounts of early Jewish and Christian history? The Copper Scroll itself hints at this possibility. Its reference to interpretation and detailed description of each and every thing suggests the Silver Scroll wasn't just a more complete treasure map, but a comprehensive archive of information about the hidden materials. If religious documents were hidden along with physical treasure, the Silver Scroll might have contained translations, interpretations, or historical context that would be invaluable to understanding Second Temple Judaism. Such information would have been incredibly dangerous to medieval Christian authorities. If the Templars discovered documentary evidence that contradicted official church teaching about the origins of Christianity, they would have possessed the kind of explosive knowledge that could destroy the institutional foundations of European civilization. This might explain why the Templars were destroyed so thoroughly, and why their accusers were so determined to eliminate not just the organization, but any trace of their secret knowledge. If they possessed alternative religious texts or historical documents that threatened Christian orthodoxy, their suppression would have been a matter of institutional survival for the Church. The mystery of the Silver Scroll represents more than a missing archaeological artifact. It potentially represents a lost key to understanding the true relationship between Judaism and Christianity, the real history of the temple treasure, and the secret knowledge that powerful organizations have been willing to kill to suppress. Whether the Silver Scroll was found by the Templars, discovered by other treasure hunters, or remains hidden somewhere in the Judean wilderness, its existence suggests that the Copper Scroll was just the beginning of a much larger archive of hidden knowledge. The question isn't whether this knowledge exists, the question is who has access to it and what they're willing to do to keep it secret. In a world where religious institutions still wield enormous political and economic power, the discovery of documents that could undermine their authority would be just as dangerous today as it was in medieval times. The Silver Scroll isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a potential weapon that could reshape our understanding of the ancient world and the modern religions that claim authority over billions of believers. The search for the Silver Scroll continues, but not in the desert caves of Qumran. It continues in the archives of secret societies, the vaults of powerful institutions, and the private collections of individuals who understand that some knowledge is too dangerous to share with the world. While the world focused on the obvious treasures hidden in the Qumran caves, the biblical manuscripts and sectarian documents, something far more subversive, was hiding in plain sight. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were multiple copies of books that had been systematically excluded from the biblical canon, forbidden texts that church authorities didn't want believers to read. The most prominent of these banned books is the Book of Enoch, found in numerous fragments throughout the Qumran caves. This wasn't a rare or marginal text. It was one of the most popular religious works in Second Temple Judaism, quoted by multiple New Testament authors and considered authoritative by early Christian communities. Yet by the 4th century, CE church authorities had deemed it too dangerous for inclusion in the official biblical canon. Why? What was so threatening about the Book of Enoch that it had to be suppressed? The answer becomes clear when you examine its content. Enoch contains detailed descriptions of fallen angels who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, weaponry, cosmetics, and other technologies that were supposedly reserved for divine beings. These angels then intermarried with human women, producing a race of giants who corrupted the earth and prompted God to send the Great Flood as punishment. But here's what makes this narrative so dangerous to Orthodox Christianity. It suggests that human knowledge and technological advancement aren't gifts from God, but stolen secrets obtained through rebellion against divine authority. It implies that much of what we consider civilization, agriculture, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, originated from supernatural beings who were acting in defiance of God's will. Even more subversive, the Book of Enoch describes these fallen angels as teachers and enlighteners who expanded human consciousness and capability. From a certain perspective, they weren't villains, but liberators, freeing humanity from ignorance and divine oppression. This interpretation transforms the traditional narrative of good versus evil into a complex story about knowledge authority and the price of enlightenment. Church authorities recognize the subversive potential of these ideas. If believers started thinking of knowledge-seeking as inherently rebellious, if they began questioning whether divine authority was necessarily benevolent, if they started sympathizing with figures who challenged cosmic hierarchies, the entire foundation of institutional religion would be threatened. So the Book of Enoch was systematically excluded from the biblical canon, its ideas marginalized, and its influence on early Christianity carefully erased from official history. By the medieval period, the text had virtually disappeared from European Christianity, surviving only in fragmentary quotations and the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. But the Qumran discovery proved that Enoch wasn't a marginal curiosity. It was mainstream Jewish religious literature widely read and highly regarded during the period when both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were taking shape. Its exclusion from the Bible wasn't based on questions of authenticity or theological significance. It was based on its dangerous potential to inspire independent thinking. The War Scroll presents an equally subversive challenge to orthodox religious thinking. This document describes the final battle between the children of light and the children of darkness, complete with detailed military formations, strategic planning, and divine intervention through angelic armies. What makes this text so disturbing isn't its apocalyptic violence. Biblical literature is full of divinely sanctioned warfare. What's disturbing is its systematic, almost technical approach to cosmic conflict. The War Scroll reads like a military manual for Armageddon, providing specific instructions for organizing troops, positioning equipment, and coordinating attacks during the end times. This document suggests that the community that produced it wasn't passively waiting for divine intervention. They were actively preparing for warfare, developing military capabilities, and expecting to participate directly in the cosmic battle between good and evil. In other words, they weren't planning to be rescued by God, they were planning to fight alongside God. Such an activist approach to apocalyptic prophecy is deeply threatening to religious authorities who prefer believers to remain passive and obedient. If people start thinking they have a role to play in cosmic events, if they begin preparing for active resistance against forces of oppression, if they start organizing for revolutionary change, the entire structure of religious and political control becomes vulnerable. Even the Isaiah scroll, which seems to confirm orthodox biblical text, contains a mystery that challenges conventional understanding. This document represents the most complete ancient copy of the Book of Isaiah, dating to approximately the 2nd century BCE. Its preservation is so extraordinary that it appears almost miraculous. After more than 2,000 years, the text remains readable and largely intact. But this miraculous preservation raises uncomfortable questions. How did ancient scribes achieve such perfect text stability across centuries of hand copying? Why does this version of Isaiah match later Masoretic texts so precisely when other ancient manuscripts show significant variation. The level of textual consistency is almost unnatural, suggesting either extraordinary scribal discipline or systematic editorial control that standardized variant traditions into a single authorized version. If the latter explanation is correct, then the Isaiah scroll might represent not the authentic ancient text, but an early example of religious authorities imposing textual uniformity for ideological purposes. In other words, what we consider the authentic biblical text might actually be the product of deliberate editorial manipulation designed to eliminate inconvenient theological variations. The forbidden books found at Qumran represent more than alternative religious literature. They represent alternative ways of thinking about divine authority, human knowledge, and the relationship between spiritual and political power. They suggest that Second Temple Judaism was far more diverse, more questioning and more revolutionary than either modern Judaism or Christianity wants to acknowledge. Most dangerous of all, they demonstrate that the process of creating the biblical canon wasn't guided by divine inspiration or scholarly objectivity. It was guided by institutional politics and the determination of religious authorities to suppress ideas that threatened their control over believers. The books that were excluded from the Bible weren't excluded because they were false or unimportant. They were excluded because they were too true, too important, and too dangerous for ordinary believers to read without supervision. And the guardians of these texts spent 40 years making sure that dangerous truth remained buried in the desert where it belonged. In the early 1950s, French scholar André Dupont-Sommer dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the Christian world. After studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, he made a startling announcement. The mysterious figure, known as the Teacher of Righteousness, described in the sectarian documents, bore such striking similarities to Jesus Christ that Christianity might be based on earlier Jewish traditions rather than unique divine revelation. The parallels were undeniable and deeply unsettling. Like Jesus, the Teacher of Righteousness was a charismatic religious leader who challenged the established religious authorities of his time. Like Jesus, he gathered a community of devoted followers who believed he possessed special insight into divine will. Like Jesus, he was persecuted by the religious establishment and may have been executed for his teachings. Most disturbing of all, the Teacher of Righteousness lived and died approximately 100 years before the traditional dates of Jesus' ministry. If Dupont-Sommer was right, then Christianity wasn't the radical new revelation that believers had been taught to accept. It was a recycled version of earlier Jewish messianic traditions, possibly even a fictional narrative based on historical figures who had lived generations earlier. The reaction from the Christian establishment was swift and vicious. Catholic scholars on the international team immediately launched a coordinated attack on Dupont-Sommer's credibility, questioning his translations, challenging his interpretations, and attempting to discredit his scholarship. They couldn't refute his evidence, so they tried to destroy his reputation instead. But the damage was done. Independent scholars around the world began examining the Dead Sea Scrolls for themselves, and many reached similar conclusions. The figure described as the Teacher of Righteousness in documents like the Habakkuk commentary and the Damascus document shared too many characteristics with the Gospel Jesus to be coincidental. Both figures were described as teachers who revealed hidden meanings in prophetic texts. Both were said to possess divine authority to interpret Scripture. Both attracted followers who believed they were living in the end times. Both were persecuted by corrupt religious authorities who refused to accept their teachings. Even more suggestively, both were associated with communities that practiced ritual purification communal meals and shared property practices that Christianity claims as unique innovations, but which the Dead Sea Scrolls prove were already established in pre-Christian Jewish sectarian movements. The parallels extended beyond biographical details to specific theological concepts. The scrolls describe the Teacher of Righteousness as a figure who would suffer for the sins of his people, who would be vindicated by God after death, and who would return in the end times to establish divine justice. These are precisely the messianic expectations that Christians attribute to Jesus. But here's where the mystery becomes even more complex. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't just describe one teacher of righteousness. They refer to multiple figures with this title, suggesting that teacher of righteousness was a role or office rather than a specific individual. Different communities apparently had their own teachers of righteousness who fulfilled similar functions in their respective movements. This discovery is devastating to Christian claims of uniqueness. If there were multiple Jewish teachers who were described with messianic characteristics, if communities throughout Second Temple Judaism were expecting suffering and vindicated messiahs, if the specific combination of ideas attributed to Jesus was actually a common pattern in pre-Christian Jewish thought, then what exactly made Jesus special? The question becomes even more troubling when you examine the Melchizedek document, another Dead Sea Scroll that describes a divine figure who will come to earth to establish justice and salvation. This mysterious figure is identified both as the Messiah and as Yahweh himself, suggesting that some Jewish communities expected the Messiah to be a divine being rather than a merely human leader. The parallels to Christian theology are exact. Like Jesus in the New Testament, the Melchizedek figure is described as both human and divine, both Messiah and God incarnate. The theological concepts that Christians claim as unique divine revelations were apparently already established in pre-Christian Jewish thought. These discoveries don't necessarily prove that Jesus was fictional, as some sensationalist theories suggest, but they do prove that the ideas attributed to Jesus weren't unique, weren't revolutionary, and weren't evidence of divine revelation. They were part of a broader Jewish theological tradition that had been developing for centuries before the traditional dates of Jesus' ministry. Even more disturbing, the teacher of righteousness traditions suggest a possible template for creating fictional messianic narratives. If Jewish communities were already telling stories about suffering vindicated teachers who revealed divine truth and would return in the end times, it would be relatively simple to create a new version of this narrative set in a different time and place. The Gospel accounts of Jesus' life and teaching contain numerous historical anachronisms, geographical errors, and theological inconsistencies that suggest they were written by people who weren't familiar with first-century Palestine. If these accounts were based on earlier teacher of righteousness traditions rather than eyewitness testimony, such errors would be easily explained. This raises the most dangerous question of all. What if the Jesus described in the Gospels wasn't a single historical individual, but a literary compilation of various teacher of righteousness traditions? What if Christianity was created by combining real Jewish theological concepts with mythological narratives about figures who may never have existed in the form described by the New Testament? The teacher of righteousness mystery threatens the very foundation of Christian faith. It suggests that Christianity might be based not on historical events, but on historical fiction, carefully crafted stories that combined authentic Jewish religious traditions with invented biographical details to create a compelling but ultimately false narrative about divine intervention in human history. No wonder the Catholic gatekeepers fought so hard to suppress this evidence. No wonder they spent 40 years ensuring that only approved interpretations reached the public. The teacher of righteousness wasn't just another interesting historical figure. He was proof that the entire Christian story might be nothing more than ancient propaganda disguised as divine revelation. By the 1980s, the academic world was splitting into armed camps over the Dead Sea Scrolls. On one side stood the international team and their institutional supporters desperately defending the official narrative and their exclusive control over the materials. On the other side, a growing coalition of independent scholars, journalists, and researchers demanded access to the suppressed documents and alternative interpretations of the evidence. At the center of this war was Professor Robert Eisenman of California State University, a maverick scholar whose theories were so explosive that the academic establishment tried to destroy his career rather than engage with his arguments. Eisenman had spent years studying the available Dead Sea Scroll materials and reached conclusions that threatened everything the religious gatekeepers were trying to protect. According to Eisenman's research, the scrolls didn't describe an isolated Essene community, but the mainstream Jewish religious movement that eventually produced both rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. The teacher of righteousness wasn't a mysterious sectarian leader, but James the Just, the brother of Jesus, who led the Jerusalem church after Jesus' death. The wicked priest who persecuted the teacher wasn't a corrupt Jewish high priest, but the Apostle Paul, who corrupted Jesus' original Jewish message by making it acceptable to Gentile converts. These theories were heretical to both Jewish and Christian orthodoxy. If Eisenman was right, then Christianity as we know it wasn't the authentic teaching of Jesus, but a Pauline corruption that replaced Jewish religious law with Gentile-friendly theology. The real followers of Jesus, including his own family members, would have remained observant Jews who rejected Paul's innovations. Even more controversially, Eisenman suggested that the Dead Sea Scrolls contained contemporary accounts of first-century events, including possible references to the crucifixion of Jesus and the conflict between different factions of early Christianity. If these documents were historical records rather than ancient religious texts, they might provide independent confirmation or contradiction of gospel accounts. The international team's response was swift and vicious. They denied Eisenman access to unpublished materials, excluded him from academic conferences, and launched personal attacks on his character and scholarship. When he persisted in promoting his theories, they escalated to legal threats and attempts to have him fired from his university position. But Eisenman wasn't alone. Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago was simultaneously challenging the Essene theory from a different angle, arguing that the scrolls represented a library rescued from Jerusalem rather than the writings of a sectarian community. Like Eisenman, Golb found himself excluded from the inner circle of scroll scholarship and subjected to professional ostracism. Journalist Herschel Shanks of Biblical Archaeology Review documented the suppression campaign in detail, publishing exposés that revealed the extent to which institutional politics was corrupting biblical scholarship. His articles demonstrated how a small group of gatekeepers was using academic credentials to silence dissenting voices and protect religious orthodoxy from inconvenient evidence. The war intensified when photographer Robert H. Eisenman, no relation to Professor Eisenman, somehow obtained unauthorized access to the scroll archives and began distributing bootleg photographs to scholars worldwide. Suddenly, researchers who had been denied access for decades could examine the actual documents rather than relying on selective quotations filtered through the international team's ideological lens. What they discovered confirmed the worst fears of the gatekeepers. The unpublished materials contained exactly the kind of explosive content that independent scholars had suspected: alternative versions of biblical texts, sectarian documents that challenged religious orthodoxy, and historical references that didn't match official church timelines. The establishment's response revealed how much they had to lose. Instead of welcoming scholarly debate and independent analysis, they doubled down on suppression and control. Legal threats flew, academic careers were destroyed. Researchers who had devoted their lives to scroll scholarship found themselves blacklisted and professionally ruined for asking inconvenient questions. But the internet was beginning to change the rules of academic warfare. Information that had been successfully suppressed for decades could now be distributed instantly to scholars around the world. Photographs, translations, and alternative theories that the international team had kept secret were suddenly available to anyone with a computer connection. The gatekeepers found themselves fighting a losing battle against technology and transparency. They could destroy individual careers, but they couldn't stop the exponential spread of digital information. Their monopoly on knowledge was crumbling, and they knew it. In 1991, their worst nightmare came true when the Huntington Library announced unrestricted access to complete photographic copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The international team's 40-year monopoly was finally broken. Their exclusive control was shattered, and the evidence they had fought so hard to suppress was suddenly available to any qualified scholar who wanted to examine it. The academic war was over, but the damage was done. Decades of suppression had corrupted the entire field of biblical archaeology. Alternative theories had been silenced before they could be properly evaluated. Critical evidence had been withheld from scholarly analysis for political and religious reasons. The pursuit of truth had been subordinated to the protection of institutional interests. Most tragically, the suppression campaign had actually intensified public suspicion about the scroll's contents. If the materials were simply ancient religious texts that confirmed existing beliefs, why had the gatekeepers fought so hard to keep them secret? If alternative theories were obviously wrong, why couldn't they be refuted through open scholarly debate rather than professional destruction? The conspiracy of silence had created exactly the kind of speculation and conspiracy theories that the gatekeepers claimed to be preventing. By acting as if they had something to hide, they had convinced the world that they really did have something to hide. And maybe they did. Because when independent scholars finally gained access to the complete archive, what they found was even more explosive than anyone had imagined. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just challenge specific religious doctrines, they threatened the entire foundation of monotheistic faith. The academic war was over, but the real battle for truth was just beginning. When you step back and examine the 70-year history of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship, a clear pattern emerges that extends far beyond academic disputes or scholarly disagreements. This is the story of how powerful institutions systematically suppress inconvenient truths when those truths threaten their authority and legitimacy. The pattern begins with immediate seizure and control. Within hours of the scroll's discovery, they were removed from public access and placed under the exclusive control of a small group of gatekeepers with clear institutional loyalties. No independent verification was allowed. No alternative perspectives were invited. No democratic process determined who would have access to these documents that belonged to all humanity. Instead, a self-appointed elite decided that they alone were qualified to interpret materials that could reshape our understanding of Western civilization's religious foundations. They established a monopoly over knowledge and defended that monopoly through institutional pressure, professional intimidation, and systematic exclusion of dissenting voices. The second phase involved the creation of official narratives designed to minimize the scroll's threatening implications. The Essene theory wasn't developed through objective analysis of the evidence. It was constructed to provide a safe, contained explanation that wouldn't challenge existing religious orthodoxy. By portraying the scrolls as the product of an isolated sect with minimal influence on mainstream religious development, the gatekeepers could acknowledge their historical importance while denying their contemporary relevance. Alternative theories that suggested broader significance. Jerusalem origins mainstream Jewish authorship connections to early Christianity were systematically marginalized, not through scholarly refutation, but through professional ostracism. Scholars who proposed uncomfortable ideas found themselves excluded from conferences, denied access to materials, and subjected to personal attacks on their credibility and character. The third phase involved the deliberate suppression of the most potentially explosive materials. While relatively safe documents like biblical manuscripts were published, promptly fragments that contained sectarian writings, alternative theological perspectives, or historically sensitive content remained perpetually under study. The gatekeepers used their monopoly to ensure that dangerous evidence never reached the public, while simultaneously claiming that their delays were motivated by scholarly caution and professional responsibility. This suppression created exactly the information vacuum that breeds conspiracy theories and speculation. When authorities act as if they have something to hide, people naturally assume they really do have something to hide. The gatekeeper's own behavior convinced the world that the scrolls contained explosive secrets, whether they actually did or not. The fourth phase involved damage control, when the suppression finally collapsed. Once independent scholars gained access to the complete archive in 1991, the gatekeepers shifted from suppression to spin control. They acknowledged that alternative theories deserved consideration, while continuing to promote their preferred interpretations. They admitted that mistakes had been made while defending the overall validity of their conclusions. Most importantly, they emphasized the complexity and ambiguity of the evidence, suggesting that multiple interpretations were possible and that definitive conclusions might never be reached. This relativistic approach served their interests by preventing any single alternative theory from gaining sufficient credibility to overthrow the established narrative. But the most disturbing aspect of this pattern is how it reveals the broader corruption of academic institutions by political and religious interests. Universities that should have been champions of free inquiry allowed their faculties to be intimidated and silenced. Archaeological organizations that should have demanded open access to significant discoveries endorse monopolistic control by ideologically motivated gatekeepers. Religious institutions that claim to value truth above all else actively worked to suppress evidence that might challenge their authority. Government agencies that funded scholarly research allowed that research to be corrupted by institutional biases and personal agendas. The Dead Sea Scrolls case demonstrates how easily democratic societies can be manipulated when small groups of experts claim exclusive authority over important information. The public's trust in scholarly objectivity and academic integrity was exploited to prevent scrutiny of evidence that belonged to all humanity. This pattern isn't unique to biblical archaeology. Similar dynamics appear whenever institutions face evidence that threatens their legitimacy. Climate science, pharmaceutical research, economic analysis, political polling, any field where powerful interests have stakes in particular outcomes becomes vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation and suppression that corrupted scroll scholarship. The gatekeepers always claim they're protecting the public from dangerous misinformation or premature conclusions. They always insist that they're the only ones qualified to interpret complex evidence. They always argue that open access would lead to sensationalism and misunderstanding. But the Dead Sea Scrolls case proves that the real danger comes not from public access to difficult evidence, but from institutional control over that evidence. When small groups of experts can determine what information reaches the public and how that information is interpreted, democratic decision-making becomes impossible. The pattern of suppression succeeds only as long as the public trusts institutional authorities more than their own ability to evaluate evidence. Once that trust is broken, once people realize they've been systematically deceived by the very experts they relied on for truth, the entire system of academic and religious authority becomes vulnerable to collapse. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls controversy is about much more than ancient religious texts. It's about whether we live in a society where truth is determined by evidence and democratic deliberation, or by institutional power and elite manipulation. The pattern of suppression reveals which kind of society we actually have, and that revelation might be the most dangerous truth of all. After 70 years of research, suppression, and controversy, what can we definitively say about the Dead Sea Scrolls? What truths have emerged despite the best efforts of institutional gatekeepers to control the narrative? And what questions remain unanswered because evidence has been systematically withheld, manipulated, or destroyed? The first forbidden truth is that the scrolls represent mainstream Jewish religious thought from the most crucial period in Western history. They aren't the curiosity of an isolated sect, but the intellectual foundation of both rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. The ideas that both religions claim as unique divine revelations were already circulating in Jewish communities decades or centuries before their supposed origin dates. This means that neither Judaism nor Christianity developed through special divine intervention. They evolved from existing religious traditions through natural historical processes that can be studied and understood using normal scholarly methods. The supernatural explanations that both religions offer for their origins are demonstrably false. The second forbidden truth is that the figure described as Jesus in the New Testament wasn't unique. Multiple Jewish teachers during the Second Temple period were described with identical characteristics: divine inspiration, messianic authority, persecution, by religious authorities, death and vindication, expected return in the end times. The gospel narratives about Jesus follow patterns that were already well established in Jewish religious literature. This doesn't necessarily prove that Jesus was fictional, but it does prove that nothing about his supposed life and teaching was unprecedented or inexplicable. Christianity wasn't a radical new religion, but a predictable development within existing Jewish messianic traditions. The third forbidden truth is that the books included in the biblical canon were chosen for political reasons rather than theological merit. Texts like the Book of Enoch were excluded not because they were less authentic or less inspired than canonical books, but because they contained ideas that threatened institutional religious authority. The Bible isn't a divinely guided collection of sacred texts, but a carefully edited anthology designed to support particular interpretations of Jewish and Christian doctrine. Alternative religious traditions were systematically suppressed to create the illusion of theological consensus where none actually existed. The fourth forbidden truth is that the physical treasure described in the Copper Scroll almost certainly exists and may already have been found. The temple treasure wasn't destroyed by the Romans, but hidden by Jewish religious leaders who created detailed instructions for its recovery. Whether those instructions have been successfully used remains unknown, because anyone who found such treasure would have overwhelming reasons to keep the discovery secret. The missing temple artifacts represent more than lost wealth. They're physical proof of the historical reality behind the religious narratives that billions of people accept as divinely revealed truth. Their recovery could provide archaeological evidence that either confirms or contradicts crucial claims about ancient Jewish and Christian history. The fifth forbidden truth is that modern archaeological and biblical scholarship has been fundamentally corrupted by institutional interests. The Dead Sea Scrolls case proves that academic objectivity disappears when evidence threatens powerful religious, political, or economic interests. Scholarly conclusions can't be trusted when the scholars involved have institutional loyalties that conflict with honest investigation. This corruption extends far beyond biblical archaeology. Any field where research results could challenge established authority becomes vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation and suppression that characterized scroll scholarship for 4 decades. But perhaps the most dangerous forbidden truth is that ordinary people are perfectly capable of evaluating complex evidence when they have access to complete information. The gatekeeper's claim that the public needs protection from dangerous or confusing evidence is revealed as self-serving propaganda designed to maintain expert authority over democratic decision-making. The real reason institutional authorities suppress controversial evidence isn't to protect the public, but to protect themselves. They understand that informed citizens are less likely to accept expert pronouncements without independent verification. They know that democratic access to information threatens hierarchical control over society. What they don't want you to know isn't just the specific secrets hidden in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What they don't want you to know is that you don't need their permission to seek truth, evaluate evidence, and reach your own conclusions about the most important questions facing humanity. The scrolls themselves have become secondary to the larger question of whether we live in a society where truth is determined by evidence and democratic deliberation, or by institutional power and expert manipulation. The answer to that question will determine not just how we interpret ancient religious texts, but how we understand the nature of knowledge, authority, and freedom in the modern world. The forbidden truth isn't hidden in desert caves or ancient manuscripts, It's hidden in plain sight in the pattern of suppression and control that characterizes every institution that claims authority over human consciousness. Once you recognize that pattern, you can never again trust institutional claims about what you're allowed to know, what questions you're permitted to ask, or what conclusions you're supposed to reach. And that recognition is the most dangerous knowledge of all. Today, the treasure hunters continue their work in the Judean desert. Armed with ground-penetrating radar satellite imagery and sophisticated archaeological techniques, they're following the cryptic clues of the Copper Scroll through wadis and valleys that have changed little since ancient times. Some claim to have identified possible locations. Others insist they've found evidence of ancient excavations at sites that match the scroll's descriptions. But the real search isn't happening in the desert anymore. It's happening in university libraries, government archives, and private collections around the world, because the most important discoveries aren't waiting to be dug up, they're waiting to be revealed. How many crucial scroll fragments remain in private hands, inaccessible to scholars and unknown to the public? How many alternative theories have been suppressed because they threaten institutional interests? How many connections between ancient Jewish thought and early Christianity remain unexplored because examining them would undermine religious orthodoxy? The technology that revealed hidden text and challenged established dating continues to advance. Artificial intelligence systems are becoming more sophisticated in their analysis of ancient handwriting and linguistic patterns. DNA sequencing is providing more detailed information about the origins and history of parchment and leather materials. Imaging techniques are revealing layers of information that previous generations of scholars never suspected existed. Each technological advance threatens to uncover new evidence that contradicts official narratives and challenges established authority. The institutions that spent 40 years suppressing inconvenient truths about the Dead Sea Scrolls now face an environment where suppression is becoming increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive. But they're adapting their strategies. Instead of controlling access to evidence, they're attempting to control interpretation of evidence. Instead of suppressing alternative theories, they're promoting confusion and relativism that makes definitive conclusions impossible. Instead of claiming exclusive authority, they're encouraging public skepticism about the possibility of reaching any reliable conclusions at all. The new suppression doesn't look like the old suppression. It's more subtle, more sophisticated, and potentially more effective. When people believe that truth is unknowable, they stop looking for it. When they accept that all interpretations are equally valid, they stop evaluating evidence. When they embrace uncertainty as wisdom, they abandon the democratic right to reach their own conclusions about important questions. This sophisticated nihilism serves institutional interests just as effectively as crude censorship, but it's much harder to recognize and resist. The public thinks they're being offered intellectual freedom when they're actually being encouraged to abandon intellectual responsibility. Meanwhile, the physical search for Copper Scroll treasure continues to attract adventurous archaeologists and conspiracy theorists who believe that dramatic discoveries are still possible. They may be right. The Judean wilderness has revealed many of its secrets, but it hasn't revealed all of them. Whether future discoveries will confirm or contradict current theories about the scrolls remains unknown. But one thing is certain: any significant new evidence will face the same institutional resistance that characterized the response to the original discoveries. Powerful interests will continue to suppress, manipulate, or discredit findings that threaten their authority. The search for truth about the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't just an archaeological project or an academic exercise. It's a test of whether democratic societies can maintain access to information that challenges established power structures. It's a measure of whether ordinary citizens can preserve the right to evaluate evidence and reach independent conclusions about fundamental questions. The scrolls themselves have become symbols of a larger struggle between institutional authority and democratic inquiry. They represent the eternal conflict between those who claim exclusive access to truth and those who insist that truth belongs to everyone. That conflict didn't end when the Huntington Library broke the academic monopoly in 1991. It didn't end when independent scholars gained access to previously suppressed materials. It didn't end when new technologies revealed hidden information that contradicted expert conclusions. The conflict continues every time someone asks uncomfortable questions about religious authority, academic credibility, or institutional truthfulness. It continues every time someone demands evidence instead of accepting expert pronouncements. It continues every time someone insists on thinking for themselves rather than deferring to credentials and titles. The real treasure isn't hidden in the desert caves of Qumran. It's hidden in the human capacity for independent thought and democratic deliberation. The real scrolls aren't ancient manuscripts written on parchment and copper. They're the principles of free inquiry and open access to information that make democratic civilization possible. And the real enemies aren't Roman legions or ancient persecutors. They're the modern institutions that claim authority over human consciousness and demand obedience rather than understanding. The search continues because the stakes are too high to abandon. The questions raised by the Dead Sea Scrolls go to the heart of how we understand ourselves, our history, and our relationship to the truth. Those questions won't be answered by experts or institutions. They'll be answered by ordinary people who refuse to let others think for them and who insist on their right to examine evidence, evaluate arguments, and reach their own conclusions about the most important issues facing humanity. The search continues because freedom depends on it. What we discovered tonight changes everything we thought we knew about ancient history, religious authority, and institutional truthfulness. We've seen how a small group of gatekeepers controlled humanity's access to its own heritage for 4 decades. We've examined evidence of billion-dollar treasures still hidden in the desert. We've explored suppressed theories that could rewrite our understanding of Judaism and Christianity. But questions remain that may never be answered completely. What other secrets lie buried in unexplored caves? What crucial evidence remains locked away in private collections? Who benefits from keeping the truth about our religious heritage hidden from public view? What we still don't know is whether we live in a society brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths, or whether we prefer comfortable lies that protect existing power structures. We don't know whether the institutions that suppressed this evidence for decades have truly changed, or whether they've simply developed more sophisticated methods of control. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to never again accept expert authority without independent verification. Question credentials, demand evidence, think for yourself. The truth about the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't just about ancient religious texts. It's about whether you have the right to know what's real and what's fiction in your own world. The gatekeepers want you to believe that some knowledge is too dangerous for ordinary people to understand. They want you to trust their interpretations instead of examining evidence for yourself. They want you to remain passive consumers of information rather than active seekers of truth. But you have the power to refuse their limitations. You have the right to ask uncomfortable questions, challenge official narratives, and reach your own conclusions about the evidence. That right is what democracy means, and it's what the suppression of the Dead Sea Scrolls was really designed to destroy. Subscribe to join the search for forbidden truths they don't want you to discover. Next week, the Vatican's secret archives. What are they really hiding in those underground vaults? We'll follow the money, examine the evidence, and reveal the institutional connections that link ancient suppression to modern cover-ups. Until then, remember, the greatest conspiracy isn't what they're hiding from you. It's convincing you that you don't have the right to know. Keep questioning everything. Keep seeking truth. Keep thinking for yourself. Because once you start, you'll never want to stop.